Hello everyone, it's Penny Hoare speaking. We have had a slight technical hitch tonight. We are unable to see a picture of Mandy's face talking to us, but we can see her slides, and we'll try and fix that during the session. I'll just explain the procedure today. So I'll be signing off and solving all the technical problems. Mary Lush will be the chairperson. She's the organiser, and Mary talent-spotted Mandy, who's going to be the speaker tonight. Then at the end of the session, we'll be having questions. I'll pass over to you now, Mary, if you're okay.
Okay, yes. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Mandy, our speaker tonight then is Mandy Watson. So Mandy holds a degree in agricultural science, and she works for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, better known as DELP. She's been in Warrnambool working on whales for some 20 plus years, or whales and other things, I believe. And before Warrnambool, Mandy worked in Central Australia for the Central Land Council. And at this point, I should say that we acknowledge the peoples of the Warrnambool and Eastern Mara as the traditional custodians of the Otway region. And they have probably been whale watching for millennia. And we pay our respects to them. And Mandy obviously has a good knowledge of Indigenous, well, I don't know quite what we know about Indigenous knowledge of whales. Perhaps it would be one of the things that she tells us. Okay, so Mandy was working in Central Australia for the Central Land Council. And it seems actually quite unlikely that experience in Central Australia was one of the key selection criteria for a job working on whales in Warrnambool. And there is a bit more, in fact, to the story, which Mandy may or may not tell you if you ask her a question. The net result, though, is that Mandy, and I quote her here, landed on her feet, unquote, when she started this work. So Mandy, if you could take over with the slides, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Mary and Penny, and thanks everybody for having me and for coming along tonight. It's a pretty awful night out there, and I suspect most of you are all tucked up in your cosy homes, as am I. So I'll jump into my presentation, and if there's anything that you were hoping that I would cover that I haven't covered, please drop it into the Q&A and we'll attempt to get to that at the end. The focus of my presentation is on southern right whales, but I will talk a little bit at the beginning about some of the other whales that we see in our region. So just a little bit about taxonomic classification, and apologies to those of you who are here who already know some of this stuff. There's two suborders of Cetacea, the Mysticetes and the Odontoceti. And underneath the Mysticetes, we have a number of families, but you can see that underneath the Odontoceti suborder, we have quite a few more families. So there's far more of the toothed whales than there are of the baleen whales in terms of species. And I'll be focusing my talk tonight around the baleen whales, or the Mysticetes. So just to touch on the toothed whales, the word Odontocetes comes from the Greek odontos for tooth and ketos for whale. These whales hunt and feed on individual prey items, and they also have active sonar for echolocation, which involves them emitting high frequency sound that reflects back from their prey. So that's something that they have to assist them with their feeding and their foraging. Whereas with the Mysticetes, the baleen whales, and the name originates from the Greek mystax, meaning upper lip or moustache, ketos whale. And these whales feed on very large amounts of very small animals, and they're not capable of active echolocation. So they're the two key differences between those two groups. Now, we're talking about, as I said, I'll be talking about the baleen whales. I'll touch on some of the species, or the three main species that we are interested in. The large whale species of baleen whale that we are very lucky to have in our southwest coastal waters. So we have the blue whale. Blue whale is the largest whale of all the whales. It can grow up to about 33 metres and weigh up to 160 tonnes. Has a very small dorsal fin and small pectoral flippers. And the reason it's called a blue whale is it does appear to be bright blue through the water. So their skin is actually grey looking up close, but it has this unique feature that when you look at it through water, it does glow this sort of iridescent, beautiful blue colour. Now, this is one of the Warrnambool whales of the baleen whales, Warrnambool group. Rorquals are the whales that have the throat grooves. So that allows them to expand out their throat when they're feeding and take in very vast quantities of water and food. And the blue whale in our region occurs in the Bonnie upwelling during the summer months. The Bonnie upwelling is this amazing phenomenon where we get a cold water upwelling happening off the continental shelf, which is driven by easterly winds at the beginning of, well, in spring and the beginning of summer, pushing that cold water up, which is very nutrient rich, and sets off this incredible food chain, which is a highly productive area of the shelf there, and it produces a lot of food for a lot of species. And that's why we are lucky enough to get blue whales come to feed in this area. Now, it's generally a fair way offshore, but there are places where you can see them from shore occasionally. So where Portland is, and it sticks out into the ocean there, the continental shelf comes in a lot closer down at Portland, and I have been lucky enough to see blue whales feeding off Portland from the shore there. I've also been lucky enough to go up and do aerial surveys with Peter Gill, who's a blue whale researcher that lives in our region. So I've been very fortunate, and also worked with him on some satellite tagging work. So I've been very fortunate to have seen some of these whales. I think there are occasional bird cruises, and there used to be some aerial-based blue whale watching that worked out of Portland. So unless you get an opportunity to do one of those things, it is a pretty rare thing to see them from shore. The other one that many of you will have seen, though, is the humpback whale. It's a smaller whale than the blue whale, obviously, only goes up to about 18 metres, weighing about 45 tonnes. They have a distinctive humped back with a dorsal fin and very long pectoral flippers, which is one of the really key identifying features for this species when you are looking out to sea. They're often slapping these pectoral fins on the water, and they're very long and very thin. Now, humpback whales migrate through southwestern Victorian waters from their feeding grounds down near Antarctica to their breeding grounds in Queensland every winter. And they're usually seen further offshore and usually travelling east, plenty travelling west as well. Now, the humpback whale is a very well-known whale, great whale for whale watching because there's so many of them. And they're also a very acrobatic species, so they're quite streamlined and very active, known to be very active at sea. You can see that this is also one of the Rorqual whales from the baleen whale groups. And last but not least is the whale that I want to talk to you about tonight, is the southern right whale. Similar in length to the humpback whale, but weighing almost twice as much, can weigh up to about 80 tonnes. Very black skin, sometimes with white belly markings. Sometimes you can get grey ones, which are quite rare. About 3%, we believe, are what we call grey, which is a mottled sort of dark brown grey colour. The photograph on the bottom left of this slide shows you a photograph of 3 southern right whales together that I photographed off Portland. 2 of the normal black colour and 1 of the greys. So they're quite rare, the population, but we certainly have seen plenty of them coming through Victorian waters. A key identifying feature for southern rights at sea is the lack of a dorsal fin. They have a very squared, short pectoral flipper, and they also have this distinctive V-shaped blow. So the other two species that I mentioned, the humpback whale and the blue whale, is generally just a very tall, straight plume. And the right whale has this lovely V-shaped blow. And so if you see that out at sea, before you see anything else, you can be pretty confident that you've got a right whale. Now, the other thing that I'm going to talk to you a lot more about later on in our presentation is that these whales also have these growths around the head called Callosities, which are thickened patches of skin that they're born with. And those patches of skin become colonised with tiny white critters called cyamids. Now, they're quite different to humpbacks. Do have quite knobbly heads, but that is not the same thing. These are very, very distinct features that are colonised by these little cyamids. So these are the three main baleen whale species that we have in our waters, and the ones that you are more likely to see are the humpback whale and the southern right whale. Now, in terms of the right whale biology, it's a migratory species, as are the humpback and the blue whale. Their foraging grounds are located between about 45 and 50 degrees south, so they're actually not as far south as the humpback whale. So they feed in subantarctic waters. They're feeding mostly on copepods, which are small krill-like creatures. And they migrate to their calving grounds on the southern Australian coastline during the winter months for their calving. So it's mostly pregnant females that are migrating. It's not the entire population. So the females that are not calving in their non-calving years are not necessarily migrating. And likewise, probably not all of the male population is migrating to the southern coast. So in terms of working out population estimate, it's really important to understand this biology, because what we have on the coast is essentially 1/3 of the breeding female population in any given year. Now, the females have this fantastic phenomenon called calving site fidelity. So they return to the same calving grounds each year to calve and to nurse their young. And they have a very strong affinity for those calving grounds. So that's known as cultural memory. And we know this because the females are very rarely seen in Australia any year before calving. We know that their calving is once every 3 years approximately. They're sexually mature at around 6 years of age. Their gestation is around 1 year, 12 months, and calves are weaned at 1 to 2 years. So when they're here on our coast, they spend most of their time in very shallow inshore waters, which does tend to surprise people when they come across them. So they can be seen often just behind the surf line, just off the shore. And that sometimes alarms people because they think that such a large whale shouldn't be so close to shore, and that they are concerned that it might be about to strand. But when we talk to people and we can explain that the species is a southern right whale, and that's quite normal behaviour for those whales. Now, in terms of conservation status, so nationally they're considered endangered under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. The current national population estimate is around 3,000, so it's not very large. There are 10 known calving aggregation areas across the southern coastline of Australia. And we know that there are 2 populations, what we're calling a South-East Australian population and a South-West. The South-East Australian population is thought to be limited to Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania. And the South-West is everywhere else along the southern coastline. And you can see from this map, the pink area is what we consider the current core coastal range for the species. The red blobs are what are considered very high, historic high use areas. Looks like I've got camera back. And the black dots are marking the aggregation sites, and the size of the dot denotes whether the aggregation is a large or a small. And you can see from this map that in what we consider the southeast region, we only have one established aggregation site, and it's a small aggregation, and that is the Logan's Beach calving site. So in Victoria, the southern right whale is listed under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, and it is considered endangered. And the Southeast Australian population is estimated to be around 300 individuals. So out of the 3,000 across Australia, we have only 300 in southeastern Australia. And yeah, Logan's Beach is the only established calving site. And when we say established, we mean that they calve there in at least 2 out of every 3 years. There is some evidence of calves being born in other locations, like in southeast Tasmania, the south coast of New South Wales, and outside of Logan's Beach in southwestern Victoria. But these are not regular occurrences. Now, I mentioned humpbacks before, just to sort of talk about the difference in their conservation status. The humpback whale population estimate just for the east coast of Australia alone is thought to be around 30,000 or more individuals. And there's a similar number that uses the west coast of Australia. So there are 2 groups of humpbacks, an east coast and a west coast group. So there's one group migrating from Antarctic waters up to northwestern Australia, and one group migrating from Antarctic waters up to northeastern Australia. And so around 60,000 humpbacks is thought to be migrating along the coast there. Their population is increasing at around 11% per annum. If you
Mandy, we're getting some problems hearing you.
Okay, sorry folks. So just moving along to the last slide was around the difference between humpbacks and southern rights. Just moving on to a little bit about population structuring. So I mentioned that there was an eastern and a western Australian population. This was determined through genetic studies that were conducted. We assisted with some sampling in Western Victoria, and there was sampling conducted in other parts of Australia and New Zealand. And it was found that there's significant genetic differentiation between the southwestern Australian calving grounds and the southeastern calving ground, being Logan's Beach. And in fact, that the genetic profile of Logan's Beach is closer to that of the New Zealand calving grounds, which is very interesting. Now, when we included some samples that were collected from outside of Logan's Beach, so places like Port Fairy, there was a lot less difference between the genetics. And so what that's telling us is that it's actually those calving females that are separated. And what we've long thought is that the entire Victorian coast is part of the migratory corridor for whales that are moving through for Logan's Beach, but also moving through to their calving grounds in the west. So whales that we sampled at Port Fairy were probably whales that were actually moving through on that migratory corridor on their way to the western calving grounds. So what we know is that we have a population structure in Australia that's basically driven by migratory culture, and that's that site fidelity to their breeding and feeding grounds. And we know that we've got a much smaller Southeast Australian population. It's obviously been very heavily exploited historically, so it's taking a very long time to recover. It makes sense that this is the case because the Eastern Australian calving grounds, the southern rights were pretty much almost completely wiped out. They were much more accessible than the whales in other parts of Australia. So around Eden, places like Port Fairy and Portland and South-East Tassie, there was very heavy whaling historically. So they've got a long way to go for recovery, and that genetic group is much smaller. And on top of that, they're much more vulnerable to threats from humans because they're in a part of Australia that's has a lot more a lot more human activity. So yes, I mentioned exploitation. Worldwide, there's actually 3 species of right whales: the North Atlantic right whale, the North Pacific right whale, and the Southern Hemisphere whale, which is the southern. Current population is thought to be around 400, and it's declining still. It went through a period of recovery, but now it's actually going backwards again through impacts from particularly entanglement and vessel strike. In the North Pacific, there are very, very low numbers, probably in the low hundreds, but there's really no reliable population estimates. And the Southern Hemisphere entire population for our southern right whales is around 12,000. Now, the reason these whales were so heavily exploited is because they were considered the right whale to hunt, hence the name right whale. Their stock depletion took place between about 1790 and right up to 1980. Most whales were taken during that early to mid 1800s, but there was continued illegal hunting by Russian whalers well into the late 1970s. We know that around at least 150,000 southern right whales were killed globally. It's estimated that around 60,000 were taken from Australia and New Zealand, and around 19,000 from southeastern Australia. So that tells us that probably historically the population for southeastern Australia was around that 19,000 mark, and we are clearly nowhere near that. It's got a long way to go to get back to that stage. Now, the southern rights are still threatened. Commercial whaling doesn't occur anymore for this species, but modern day threats include vessel strike, entanglement, particularly in commercial fishing gear. So in Victoria, all of the entanglements that we've had with right whales have been with commercial actively set rock lobster fishing lines. Noise disturbance through vessels, industry, seismic survey, those sorts of things. Coastal development, so offshore wind farms, oil and gas exploration and development. Climate change, and potentially over-harvesting of their prey items as well. Now, just to get into some really interesting stuff here, the southern right whale Callosities that I mentioned, this is a photograph that shows what they look like a little bit closer up, and you can see those thickened patches of skin, which are the black little mountainous structures on the top of the whale's head there. And these are occur all the way around the whale's head, but the pattern on the top of the head is the pattern that we're most interested in. Now, if we look at these diagrams, you'll see there's a nice diagram on the left of the whale's head looking down from above, and it's the pattern of Callosities on what we call the rostrum, so the top jaw and around the top jaw, so the lip patches, the bonnet, which is at the front of the top jaw, the little patches in the middle called rostral islands. The patch in front of the blowhole is called the combing, and then there's a patch behind the blowhole called the post-blowhole islands. And it's those that combination of features that we're interested in from an individual whale identification point of view. Now, there are 3 species of little creatures called sea lice or cyamids that live on southern right whales. They're specific to southern right whales, and they're slightly different in colour, but it's the cyamid ovalis, which is a white cyamid or white sea lice, and that colonises those little patches of skin around the head of a healthy whale, and it makes those patches stand out bright white against the whale's skin. So here's a fantastic close-up of that. And if you look closely, you can actually see those little legs. They look like tiny little fleas or little crabs. And they're part of a normal healthy whale. And you can see that that makes those Callosities stand out beautifully. So this species is a fantastic whale for doing individual identification on, and a photo identification study is what I've been involved with since the mid-1990s here in Warrnambool. I was lucky enough to, as Mary said earlier, I was lucky enough to land in this job back then, and was in a position to take over from my predecessors with doing southern right whale monitoring. And I became really interested in this and set up, got some funding and set up a photo identification catalogue for southeastern Australia. So that was established in 2002 with some funding from the Glenelg Hopkins CMA. And historically, this work's been done right across southern Australia by others. There was a researcher by the name of Steve Burnell who started this work at the head of the Bight in South Australia. And John Bannister from the West Australian Museum has been doing this work since the 1970s, right through South Australia and Western Australia. Now, sadly, John Bannister passed away recently, but this is his legacy. And when I became involved, there really was no sort of concerted effort to collect photo identifications from southern right whales in the southeastern part of Australia, and so that became my mission and my passion. So we've been collecting IDs from southern rights. The catalogue has photographs from Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. I've been involved in conducting photo identification flights since the early 1990s. Historically, the best way to get these identification images is to take them from the air, because you get that great picture from above, that what we call the dorsal view of the pattern that we're interested in. More recently, though, we haven't had funding for those flights, probably for at least 10 or 15 years now, and so we've had to make a bit of an effort towards collecting these images from land-based platforms, which is a lot more work in the sense that we need more images to get the complete pattern that we need. The catalogue that I've established is called the Southeast Australian Southern Right Whale Photo ID Catalogue, or Seesaw PIC. There are over 3,000 images comprising about 400 individual whales in my catalogue. Now, matching of whales, so comparing whales to each other when you've got a small catalogue is not too hard, because you can do the visual comparisons. But when you start to get to hundreds and thousands of whales, which we have across Australia, you need assistance, some sort of technological assistance with that. And so we do, what we use is a coding system. So we code those Callosities, and the system will pull out for us all of the whales in the catalogue that have similar codes. And that's probably enough information for me to go into on that now. There's probably a whole other presentation on just on photo ID matching. But these photographs here will show you, to the naked eye, sometimes it is quite easy to tell them apart. You can see there's a handful of our regular females from the Logan's Beach nursery there, and you can clearly see the differences between individuals in those photos. Now, once the Southeast Australian catalogue was established, in 2016, we got some funding to try and do a comparison between the Southeast Australian catalogue and the West Australian Museum one. And there is also a Head of Bight catalogue. And what's happened in recent years is we've actually now established a national catalogue for southern right whales. So we all put all of our, we collate our images into our own catalogues, and then we put them into the national catalogue. In the process of populating that catalogue in 2016, we did a matching exercise between the West Australian Museum whales and the Southeast Australian whales. And what we found was that of all of the whales that we compared, which was around 250 odd whales at the time, we had about 25 matches. Whales that were seen here also seen in Western Australia. So quite a small proportion, which really highlights that there are those regional differences, that we have the two separate populations. We do detect, though, in those matches, it enables us to detect long distance movements. So whales can be seen in the southeast and in the southwest in different years. We had 18 of those, and they're quite far apart, up to 3,800 kilometres. We've also had, though, quite significant within season movements up to 1,600 kilometres, and that the longest was between Cape Nelson and the head of the Bight. The same whale was seen at those two locations in one season. All but 4 of the whales that we matched were whales that are seen outside of Logan's Beach, so whales that are in the migratory corridor, which makes sense because we know that those breeding females have that strong affinity for those calving sites, and they will stay in those calving grounds generally. We did find, however, evidence of what we call reselection in a calving site by one breeding female who has been known as Wilma for a very long time to Warrnambool locals. Bit of a sad story, really, because Wilma was a well-recognised local whale. The local people recognised her actually by her tail rather than by her Callosities. She had a piece of her tail fluke missing, and so she was easily recognisable, and she had a very long history with Logan's Beach. So we had her recorded at Logan's many times over the decades, right up until 2002. And then she disappeared from Logan's Beach. And it wasn't until we did this cross-matching exercise that we actually found, we originally thought she'd either died or had stopped breeding and therefore migrating. But we actually found her in this matching exercise over at the head of the Bight in 2005 and 2010. We then followed up with a closer inspection of the head of Bight catalogue, which at that stage wasn't in the matching program that we did, and found that she has actually been regularly calving at the head of the Bight every 3 years, pretty much, since she left here. So a very interesting story, and probably the longest known reselection of a calving site by a female in Australia. No other females that we know at Logan's Beach have been matched to other locations. So we know that there's still that strong affinity for Logan's by those females. We did a bit of a sightings data analysis in 2016 as well. We had the help of a statistician on that, and that's how we came up with a population estimate and also the rate of increase. So we have a long standing sightings database that we've been maintaining at DELP for over 30 years. You combine that with the sightings information from the photo ID catalogue and some mark recapture modelling, and it popped out some numbers for us. So a population estimate of 268 individuals, a rate of increase of 4.7%, which is lower than elsewhere. We know that at least 93 calves were born between 1980 and 2018. So we have an average of 2.6 calves per year at Logan's Beach, which is obviously pretty low. But the mean calving interval is a little bit longer than at other locations. So with what we've got happening in the South-East is a small population with a lower rate of increase, a slightly longer calving interval, and is subject to probably greater threats. The other thing is that we didn't detect any significant change in the number of cow-calf pairs at Logan's Beach over the last 3 decades, so that's also a little bit concerning. We've started to deploy new technology in the research program. We're starting to use drones to help us with our photo ID work and also to get a better handle on calf survivability and whale health. We started this work in 2017 and that's ongoing. Now this work, drones are illegal to fly over whales, so this work can't be done without a wildlife research permit, and we've had to get one of those in order to do this work as well. But interesting work, we've been able to get some very high resolution photographs of calf callosity patterns. Historically, calf IDs are pretty difficult to get from land and even from aircraft. And calves are generally not targeted for photo ID work because their callosities are thought not to fully develop within the first year of life. So that makes following calves and their life histories quite a difficult thing, because if you photograph a whale when it's an adult, you actually don't know who its mother was, and you don't necessarily know where it was born. So what we are doing at the moment is trying to get a better handle on the calf IDs in the year that they're born, so that we can link them with their mothers and link them with their birth location. The two photographs on this slide show the difference in the callosity development in calves within a season. They're two different calves around about the same age with quite different callosity development stages. So there's a lot more work to do in this space, but it is possible that we can get an ID, or at least predict what an ID for a calf will be in future years. So the one on the left is an example of what we think will be a successful ID, and the one on the right is just too difficult to actually pick out. What happens is that those white cyamids, they don't colonise the skin patches until the calves are a little bit older, and there's a range of, so there's probably a couple of different species of cyamid around that calf's head on the right, and that tends to obscure the pattern, and the actual pattern doesn't stand out very clearly. Citizen science has become really important for this research. Historically, we had funding to do aerial surveys and to do photo identification flights. That funding is no longer available to us, so we've now had the assistance of a lot of photographers out there who are becoming really interested in this work. There's a batch of photographers down at Portland who are just out there every day throughout the whale season, taking photographs and sharing them on social media, and also sharing them with us. There's a handful of photographers also at the Logan's Beach platform and in the Port Campbell area. And so we've started to really to make use of this data and to promote this project, because anybody with a camera can take good photos of southern right whales, and even phone cameras these days are pretty good. So with the right opportunity, this is becoming a really important part of our work. And just to highlight that, in the last 4 years, probably around 60% of the IDs that we've collected have actually come from citizen scientists, and around 40% from us. So that's a really significant contribution, and it's got the potential to really increase our database and our data set. Citizen scientists, those photographers, have also assisted us with disentanglement operations. We had a whale that became entangled in rock lobster fishing gear in August 2018 that was brought to our attention by the photographers. We were able to locate that whale, and over a 4-day period track it down and disentangle it using special techniques and special equipment. And those photographers basically were on the lookout the entire time, monitoring the operation and keeping us in touch with where the whale was. So that was a fantastic story. So I'm just going to quickly run through some photographs that were taken by our citizen scientists to show you how effective this can be. If a whale sticks its head out of the water like this, that's the perfect ID shot. So we get the rostral, the full sort of top-down view of the rostrum there. And in that one photograph, we can get a complete ID on that whale. So that one was taken by Coralie at Logan's Beach in 2017. Sometimes from cliff tops around Portland. There's a lot of whales move through the Portland area. I think it's probably a key area for arrival for whales that are migrating west. There's a lot of socialising and even mating activity that goes on there, and the cliff tops present a great opportunity for people to get photos. So these were taken from cliff top at Cape Nelson by Mary Hartney, and there's a full ID on the left and probably a partial ID on the right there. The more classic view that you will see along the coast at places like Logan's Beach and elsewhere is this sort of looks like a log in the water. But if you get a left side and a right side, and if the whale even sticks its nose out of the water just a little bit, we can get enough. I can get a full ID just from those 3 images. Those photos were taken by Maureen McDonald in 2017. So just to start to wrap up a little bit, we're probably getting close to the end of our time. Anyone can get involved with this project. We have a platform that we're calling Whaleface, where people can register. There's information on there about how to take an ID image. You can enter your whale sightings. We don't have to have images. Images, even grainy images, are great just for confirming the species. But we don't have to have images with the data. The sighting in itself is just really important for our research in terms of helping us understand where the whales are going, what areas they're using, and what the population's doing. So that platform called Whaleface, I've put the URL up there. You can enter your sightings, upload your images if you have them. You'll receive regular updates on what's happening with the research and what's happening with the whales each season. We'll take those images and that data and use it for our photo ID matching, updating our population models and doing health assessments. So there's a little bit more information at the end here. We have the Conservation Management Plan for the Southern Right Whale, which is a national conservation plan that's actually due to be rewritten this year. But that's a really good document if anyone's interested in getting more information. And there's a couple of websites there. We have information around how to watch whales safely. There's a great animated video, which I would have shown you, but I don't think the bandwidth is probably going to be good enough for that, but you can go to the DELP website and have a look at that watching whales safely video. It's an animated video that I had made a couple of years ago just to explain to people the rules around how to approach whales and how not to approach whales, but how to respect whales and watch them safely. And just a few acknowledgements there. So thank you very much, Mary and Penny. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mandy. Just getting myself organised. Right. Okay, so Mandy, can you stay a little bit for an extra 5 or 10 minutes so we can deal with a fair few of the questions?
Absolutely, yep.
So anybody here though, I mean, who needs to leave at 8, of course, can leave at 8, don't feel embarrassed about it, but we will go on just a little bit longer. Okay, so some of the questions you've answered already. You know, they were put up and you subsequently covered it. But there's a couple of people who are interested in orcas, and one of them says that orcas have been seen at Cape Patton recently and is wondering if they're any sort of a threat to the southern right whale. Yes,
absolutely they are. My heart sinks when I hear about the orcas. And look, it's fantastic that we are starting to see a lot more orca activity in our waters. There's definitely been lots of sightings down our part of the world. And I've had over the years many reports of orca interactions with southern right whales and witnessed that myself at Logan's Beach. I can't remember what year it was. It might have been 2009. I think we had a very big year and we had, I think there were 20 or 30 whales at the nursery that year, and a pod of orcas came in and were definitely sniffing around the calves. They didn't make any serious attacks or attempts to attack the calves on that day, but it was concerning. And then last 2019, the 2 calves that were born at Logan's Beach in 2019 both died. The first calf disappeared, the mother and calf left the area, and the female returned without her calf. So we knew that that calf had died. We're not sure what happened to it, but the second calf washed up dead with very large bite marks out of it. It was apparent that sharks had been feeding on it. We're not sure what killed it, but killer whales, probably the most significant natural predator for southern right whales.
Mm. Okay, so other people have asked about risks to whales, and to some extent you've covered that. And I suppose it's a particular interest of mine. Is climate change, and one of the things that climate change does, I mean, because the temperature of the water affects whether it's sinking or rising and so on, it has big effects, as I understand it, on ocean currents. So, and they're saying now that you know, fish from warmer waters are now being found down in our sorts of areas, normally in warmer waters. Have you got any comment about the future, what we can hope for if we can hold climate change at bay?
Yeah, it's an interesting one in terms of southern right whales. So the likely effect is that, so I mentioned earlier that calving interval for the whales at Logan's Beach is slightly longer. What I forgot to mention is that we're actually seeing around the southern hemisphere an increase in the calving interval right around the southern hemisphere. So when we looked at calving intervals, the calving interval was longer in more recent years than it was in earlier years. And that's being seen at other locations. So there's a group of scientists who are looking at that as we speak. We think that's probably related to food availability. Warming oceans, shifting currents, and that would undoubtedly have an impact on prey availability, whether it just shifts the location or has impacts the availability or the amount of prey. Those sorts of things are yet to be nailed down, but there's definitely, we believe, a link between climate change and that calving interval change. So it's a really difficult one. I will say though that I went to the World Marine Mammal Conference in Barcelona in 2019, and it was really interesting because over and over, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere where they've had massive marine heat waves, very dramatic effects. Obviously we're a little bit buffered from that in the Southern Hemisphere, but there are certainly examples around Antarctica of changing food, predator-prey distribution. So some species are benefiting from that and others are not. So yeah, look, it's going to come, and some species will be better off and others will be worse off.
Right. So another part of the question about risks to whales, and I know you've said that we can read this on a website, but you might perhaps give us a little bit more information about you know, so suppose we happen to, you know, it has happened indeed at Lorne where whales have come right in close. In the time I was there, nobody actually interfered with them at all. But I believe that that's not always the case, that sometimes people paddle out and want to get closer to them. You know, is the right approach to whales, as it is to much wildlife, which is just to leave it alone?
Yeah. Yeah, look, we're lucky that southern right whales are probably one of the best large whale species to watch from shore. As I mentioned, they come in really close to shore, and so there's a number of whale watching platforms that have been set up along our coastline to facilitate that. I know that there's one at Apollo Bay, there's one at Portland, we've got the one at Logan's Beach, and they're popping up everywhere. So where these whales are aggregating, you'll find a platform pop up, I'd say. And so they're fantastic shore-based whale watching species, and I don't advocate ocean-based whale watching of southern rights at all, because of their habit of hugging the coastline, they're vulnerable to being sort of hemmed in. And I think that there's really no need to get out on a boat. If you're lucky enough to be out there and you see one, that's fantastic, so long as you maintain your 200 metres distance. And certainly females with calves are very vulnerable to disturbance, and we are concerned because they have such a strong memory, and memory plays such an important role in their life history, that we are concerned that memory, that that disturbance can impact whether or not a female will come back to calve at a particular location. Likewise, areas that are very busy, Portland being a case in point. Portland historically was a very important cow-calf area, as was Port Fairy. Those whales are yet to re-establish in those locations, and Portland is a very busy port. So whether or not that's having an impact already is an unknown, but it may be that noise is one of the things that keeps them out of these areas.
So the whale that relocated to the head of the bight, are you aware of any sort of trauma that she suffered?
No, and we're lucky at Logan's Beach that we have, well, not lucky, we by design, we have a vessel exclusion area around the Logan's Beach nursery that's been in place for many years now. So those whales are not subjected to vessel traffic, and in fact, you know, where that nursery is sitting, it's sort of outside the busy port area at Warrnambool anyway, and well away from Portland. So that's a bit of a real mystery, that one, but you know, I think it's areas that are emerging that we want to see re-emerging are the areas that we need to be really focused on. And Apollo Bay is another area where we know that whales spend plenty of time, and luckily enough, the bay itself's pretty quiet area, so he's hoping that they re-establish in that area as well. But it's if you've lost all of your breeding females from a particular location, it's going to take a chance calving at a new location, and then that calf returning, being a female and returning. So you can see how difficult it's going to be. But yes, disturbance is incredibly, these whales are very sensitive.
Okay, so there was a question about Wilma. I think we've just been talking about Wilma. She was the one that relocated, wasn't she?
Yes,
yeah,
she's
okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Now there's a interesting question here. Who or what, I suppose it's what, is your favourite whale?
Well, southern rights are definitely my favourite. I know people love orcas, and humpbacks are very spectacular. Streamlined blue whales, beautiful, but southern rights for me, the fact that they come back to these calving grounds and the females are so aligned to those particular locations. Every year it's a mystery to me and amazing to me that they arrive. I get so excited every year when they show up, and very sad when they don't. We had no females come back in 2020. We were due to get 3 of them and they didn't come. So even, I mean, it was COVID lockdown at the time, but we know they didn't come because the residents in that area were still keeping an eye out for us. And so we're hoping that this year that those females perhaps just extended by a year and we'll be back this year. But yeah, every year it's just to me a miracle, and the look of them, the Callosities, you know, the size of them, they're probably one of the most vulnerable, if not the most vulnerable large whale in the world. So love them.
So how many whales are you expecting this year on the timetable?
Yeah, so we're expecting, I think, around 3 or 4 of our whales that were due in 2020, plus another 2 that were due in 2021. So if we were lucky enough to get all of the 2020 cohort plus the 2021 cohort, we could end up with 6, and that is probably the maximum. We have seen up to 6 in a given year. But if it's becoming a trend that they're going to all do 4 years, then we might only get the 3 or 4 this year.
Okay, on an entirely different tack, but perhaps leads to things like DNA sequencing, there's a question about whether you collect whale snot, and if so, what you use it for. Yeah,
so we haven't done any whale snot for our research, but I do know researchers who are involved in that work on humpback whales, and I think there are other species that they're now doing that work on. No, the genetic work that's been done on these whales has all been done through very small skin sample biopsies. And I think we've got enough information about the genetics of the southern right whales in southeastern Australia now, plus the photo identification work, which is very non-invasive work. The photo ID can tell us as much about population structuring. A lot bigger effort, bigger bang for buck, there's no doubt about it, with genetic sampling, but photo ID, non-invasive, and gives us really important, we can basically follow individuals in the same way. So there's no plans to do that work. We're probably more interested in finding out things like what's their migration pathways, so that we can learn how to protect them better. And that's a bit of an unknown. We know that they move in pretty much an anti-clockwise pattern, so that the start of the year they seem to arrive and travel west, and throughout the season they travel west. I think I said earlier that I think Portland is an arrival point for a lot of the whales from the west, but we also get whales coming in from the east at Warrnambool and moving through as well. So it'd be great to know how they approach the coastline. That's a really important question, because there's a lot of proposals like offshore wind farm development. So there's the Star of the South wind farm proposed for East Gippsland. One of the big questions there is, how do southern right whales approach the areas around the prom where we do know that they aggregate? So those are the sorts of things I'm interested in knowing more about, so that we can protect them better.
And presumably, I assume from what you say, it's not possible to put tags on whales.
Well, it is, but we've avoided satellite tagging southern rights in southeastern Australia because the population is so small and vulnerable, because we only have a handful of, about a dozen or so breeding females in the southeast. There has been some satellite tagging work done out of New Zealand, and I think in South Australia. And as tags become more sophisticated, we might see more of that. But historically, getting a tag with enough battery life to last long enough to tell us about the northward migration, very challenging. And getting a tag to stay on a whale for that long is also very challenging. It needs to be embedded quite deep to stay on a whale. So you can imagine if you tag them on the southern, before they migrate south, they've got to stay on for 12 months, and it's difficult to achieve that. So perhaps I think probably the only way to solve the approaching the coast situation would be to do a real lot of aerial surveying at the beginning of the season over several years.
Okay, now this is a slightly negative question, but it's so if, and it goes backwards a little bit, if somebody observes people, I don't know, paddling out to whales or whatever, what should they do about it?
Yeah, so they can be reported to DELP on 136 186. It's a bit of a process because it's got to go through the customer service centre to get to our compliance staff, but they will pass that on. It's really important if people can get us information to help us follow up with the individuals involved. So when it comes to boats, identifying the boats, photographs, registration numbers of vehicles or trailers. With people, it's a lot more difficult with surfers, for example, or paddle boarders, but photographs, date, time, all that sort of information is really important. We do have compliance staff in DELP, but there's not that many of them, and they've got to deal with all compliance for all of the environmental issues along the or in the state. So that's one thing to do. If people see a whale in distress, though, entangled or perhaps even a struck or near miss with a vessel, we do have a whale and dolphin emergency hotline number that people can call, and that will be dealt with very quickly because it runs through the same process that we use for fire. Mm-hmm. So that's 1300 136 017.
Where can people get these numbers? From the website? Or?
I should have put it up on the screen. Sorry.
Well, that's okay.
If you have a look on the DELP website under wildlife emergencies.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, I think we probably should move into wrapping it up. And I would like to ask the last question, which is a slightly odd question. And it's to do with beauty. So the stereotype of a scientist tends to be someone who gets around in a lab coat, wears glasses, and is entirely buried in objectivity. But all of the scientists I know also see beauty in what they do, or in some aspect of what they do. So I would like it, Mandy, if you could tell us what you find beautiful in what you do.
Yeah, I think what motivated me to a career, this sort of a career, I suppose, was a love of animals. When I grew up, when I was a kid, we had a menagerie, and my favourite thing was basically spending time caring for them. I thought I would be a vet or a zookeeper. I actually spent a bit of time being a zookeeper after I graduated, but decided I was really more interested in the bigger conservation picture, and basically have pursued a career around conserving threatened species. And I was very lucky to land in Warrnambool in a role that enabled me to do this and to pursue funding and opportunities and be supported in doing that, to build this program around southern right whales. And for me, it's being outdoors. Just the other day I went up to Logan's Beach to see if the whales had arrived, and just standing there, the ocean was wild, the weather was awful, but I was just reinvigorated. We've all been in lockdown for a really long time now, and I'm quite desk bound in my job these days, so we don't get out and do a lot of field work, but it's just being outdoors and being able to work with animals like that. That's the beauty of it for me.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mandy. I would like to thank you on behalf of all of us. So it's a terrific presentation despite the difficulties we had, and I'm sure that, well, I certainly think that it looks like you landed on your feet when you landed in Warrnambool. So I'd also like to thank Penny for managing this Zoom session, and also the audience for being an audience and for asking questions and being interested. So thank you very much, everyone, and that's it for tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.